we'll dig more deeper into like your steps of how to talk to children about school shootings, but just a general overview of that. Like, how would you, a parent comes to you and they're like, I need to talk to my kid about this. This just happened at their school. What advice would you give them?
I think the first advice would be to have them focus on what they also need to be able to care well
Mm,
for their child. Because I think it's
yeah.
really important that we recognize that our kids are like sponges. And if
Yeah.
we're fearful, if we're anxious, if we're stressed, it's likely to be a bit of contagious and for the child to absorb that. So we want to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves so that we can take care of them well. And then I think the other part of that is making sure that we remind ourselves and the child that we're their parents and they're the
Mm.
child and they don't have to take on a parental role.
Mm,
Because I think sometimes we accidentally do that to our kids, especially when we're feeling overwhelmed.
yeah.
Yeah, I think that was something that stuck out to me immediately when I was reading your article was sometimes like it's not the child's responsibility,
Mhm.
right? Especially like for our um like emotional health, right? Or emotional responses to things like and sometimes we put that on them and that's not that's not their responsibility at all. So that really stuck out to me
Mhm.
when first reading your article. 'Cause I think sometimes as parents or as adults we can easily fall into that.
Yeah. Yeah, especially in, like, a traumatic situation that's involving children, you're like, "No, you have to stay here, and you have to be with me, and we have to just, rely on each other," but they can't handle that, especially when they're younger in, like, elementary school, like these Nashville elementary school kids. In the article, you talk about one step that is to use appropriate language based on their developmental stage, which is kind of a lot of what we talk about in this podcast actually is how do we take different topics, spiritual topics, theological topics, and make them digestible for different age ranges. So can you share with us what that would look like in this instance, maybe for a elementary schooler versus like a middle schooler, just like the different types of language you can use for them?
Sure. I think it really comes down to understanding like where are your kiddos at in their understanding of these events and
Yeah.
how are they doing and how are they thinking about it and to be able to find out some of that information before starting to share some of your own thoughts or
Mhm.
recommendations. So I want to give kind of a lighthearted example off topic and then we'll circle
Yeah.
back. I remember one of my kiddos when they were really young asked me about Santa Claus, right? And they're like, "So, I've got some questions, Dad. How on earth could he be in all these places at once?" And she just kind of left the question out there, but something felt off with the way she asked. So I paused and I was like, "Well, what are your thoughts about it?" She's like, "Well, I'm pretty much 100% sure that he's not real, but I'm just a kid and I'd like to think that he's real for at least a little while longer." Right?
Mhm.
So she really helped tell me exactly
Yeah.
where she was at and even what she needed from me in that moment. And I think on a more serious note, that's we want to take some of those lessons and apply it to this situation about checking in. Where are they at? What is it they need? How are they thinking about it? How do they understand it? And also to know that sometimes, like when these events happen, sometimes as parents, even if we don't bring it up, we maybe assume that our kids aren't aware, but they probably are. They've probably seen it
Mm.
on social media or they've had friends talking about it at school. So another thing too is to check in like, well, what have you been hearing about these things?
Yeah, that's a good point. Is there what could be maybe a repercussion of not using the right language for your child, like at different ages? What could, be something that would maybe be not harmful, but maybe confusing to them if you don't use the right type of language for them?
Yeah, and I think really, in terms of thinking about that appropriateness, that we want to be both optimistic but also realistic.
Mhm.
Mm,
As we have these tough conversations with our kids. But in terms of some of the challenges, if we aren't talking to them from where they are developmentally, that it may be that they don't actually just understand what we're trying to tell them at
mm,
all. So maybe we think we're giving helpful information and it's just not connecting with them.
yeah.
Another kind of problem that could occur here would be that we actually cause them to be a lot more anxious than what they actually are. So maybe we're providing too much information or too much detail that they just don't need at this point
Yeah.
where they are developmentally. And then the other challenge that I've seen that sometimes happens is that the kids will feel responsible in some way for
Mm,
things that are occurring. So, I think it's much more common, like you'll hear people talking about like when there's a divorce and maybe the child internalizes that somehow they're at at fault for what has happened,
Mhm.
Mhm.
that we also just need to be aware that sometimes our kids can internalize things. So, not necessarily that they would have caused a shooting, but maybe they could have done more to help a friend, or, so again, we're kind of checking in and just not assuming we know where they're at.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what do you think is the difference with the way children are experiencing interpreting these events as opposed to adults experiencing and interpreting what's going on?
Well, I think for a lot of kids that, I know a lot of children that just have that general anxiety about
Mhm.
not if this is going to happen, but when is this going to happen? And so I think
Mhm.
kids are feeling it even more so sometimes than what we are as parents. I think also another difference is just our levels of understanding about what is occurring. That, as an adult, we also know, statistically, we can kind of look at those numbers and know that by and large our kids are going to be safe when they go to school and come back. But for kids, if all they're ever hearing or
Mhm.
is about these events,
Mhm.
it'll also make it seem much more common for them, even though there has been a rise in their occurrences. So I think even just kind of be able to decipher out about the reality of where things are at, how safe or not safe are they, those sorts of issues.
Yeah. We're gonna link your article into our show notes so that our listeners can read along with that too. And I think the most of it was talking about it after it happens and how to, kind of come back into the center, into your family and talk about afterwards. Is there anything that would differ in how to prepare your kids before it happens, or it's never happened to them, but how to talk to them in preparation for, like, "Hey, I know you've been seeing a lot about it. We've been seeing a lot about these things. It's everywhere on news." How can you talk to them to, like, prepare them in advance for it if it were, to happen?
Mhm. Well, I think actually, Lauren, just the way that you even asked that question as an example is exactly what I would recommend. Of, just sitting down and having a conversation, of opening it up like we would maybe any other difficult
Mm.
conversation. That, this isn't the type of thing that you want to just spring on, while you're having lunch,
Yeah.
out and about at a restaurant. But maybe to let your kids know that, hey, I would like to set aside some special time for us just to talk about as you're maybe wrapping up the school year or going into the new school year. That I
Mhm.
know there's been a lot of challenging things that have been happening in schools. And I, as a parent, would like to just set aside some time for us just to be able to talk openly about any concerns that you have, as
Mhm.
well as some of the concerns that worry me at times.